All right, welcome everyone to volunteer retention. This is our fourth installment in the Neighborhood Council campaign skills trainings. Go ahead and let Lily in here. So since we have a small group tonight, definitely please feel free to, unmute yourself and ask a question or type a question into the chat, and I can call on you for more information, share scenarios, share ideas with each other. That's part of the goal here. So I know, Jane, we got to know each other briefly, but Lily, if you wanted to share like name, pronouns, neighborhood, and kind of what brought you here tonight, so I can get a sense of maybe what types of volunteers you're working with or what types of scenarios might be interesting to you, relevant to you.
Hi, so my name is Lily. I go by she, her, and I live in Elysian Valley. I work for a nonprofit called LA Moss. We're a place-based nonprofit, and currently I'm managing a food distribution program, and so it's all volunteer-led. Yeah, and we have volunteers on-site and off-site at our produce distribution. So yeah.
That's awesome. And how long have you been there? A long time, or you're newish?
Yeah, I actually I started in May, but it was like a part-time thing, and then I got on board full-time in January. So kind of,
Awesome.
yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
That's awesome. And then Jane, since Lily didn't get to hear, you want to just briefly share what the Bikeowave is and what your role is there?
Sure, yeah. So I volunteer at the Bikeowave, which is a community bike co-op. We provide bicycle repair education. And it's 100% volunteer run there. So I have a few functions. I'm on the board of facilitators, and then I've been doing a lot of sort of, I guess, recruitment of new volunteers, as well as kind of trying to keep them on board, since it's a very loosely structured organization. So people tend to drift in and out.
Yeah, that's definitely, I think, a lot of nonprofit organizations, and definitely a lot of like political organizations, can be like that as well. People come in, they come out. Obviously, we're in a time when volunteering in person is more difficult, or there's safety concerns. So there's a lot of different variables with that, for sure. Lily, I was just telling Jane that, a lot of this presentation is kind of tailored to like political volunteering, that kind of advocacy, since LA Forward, as you may know, is, geared towards getting people involved in local politics. But I think it really translates to working with volunteers in general. So I'm happy to share that, and just let me know if you have any questions anytime. Okay, so just a brief overview. So I kind of broke it down into 4 parts in terms of retaining volunteers, managing volunteer morale, making sure volunteers understand their role in kind of the larger project of whatever it is that your organization does. It's really important that volunteers feel appreciated, that they feel successful, and that they are successful, right? Feeling effective in what they're doing, feeling efficacious. It's important that they feel comfortable, that there are accommodations made, that it's a space where they feel comfortable, they can be themselves. And it's also really important that they understand the relationship between their role and the larger work of the organization, right? So if they're, maybe if they're doing a task that might seem kind of mundane, they're, labeling things, or they're sorting food or whatever, right? If they're sorting food and they're making sure that there aren't any rotten apples, right? That's actually an important task, right? Because we want to make sure we're, giving people, no matter how needy, they deserve quality food, right? Fresh food. So, just as a random example popped into my head. So I think those are kind of the 4 sort of principles of retaining volunteers and managing them and helping them feel successful. And I think another thing we can talk about that is probably relevant to both of your situations is kind of elevating volunteers to be leaders, right? Is that something that kind of applies? Like, you know, you're leveling people up so that they're not just like a, you know, entry level first timer volunteer, but maybe they're taking on a role where they're managing other volunteers, right? Or they're training new people who come in. Is that something that you encounter in your scenarios?
100%, yeah. And when people are kind of able to carve out that space on their own, because I think because we're all volunteers, we also have a culture of like not telling each other what to do, you know, kind of like nobody's managing anybody else really. It's you kind of have to
Right.
be self-managed. And so when people do carve that space out on their own to like take initiative to do projects, it's great. That's when they tend to stick around. But when they don't, when they're kind of like waiting to be, I guess, told what to do or, you know, given tasks to do, that's when we tend to lose them. And that's always been something that I've noticed, which can be a challenge when you have people coming in who don't like, we don't necessarily know their skills, and they're not really sure how they can really, you know, they don't really see a clear way for them to fit in, like if they don't already know how to work on bikes or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. What about you, Lily?
Yeah, we definitely encounter that. We actually have, well, we had, not anymore. We were working with LA Works, and we actually had the volunteers from LA Works with us as volunteer managers. And so they were volunteers, but they were managing most of the program. My role was just kind of to get them on board, and then focused more on community engagement. And so they take the lead most of the time. But yeah, I think just like Jane said, sometimes like when you know they're new and they're not really like on board, yeah, it's like a little difficult. But I think it's important to still like, you know, take everyone's like opinion and be considerate of how people feel even when they're new. I think that's something that we really like to do. I'm always open to ideas. I never say like this is what we're doing. I'm constantly saying like, oh well, what do you think?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
have that open communication.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think we can talk about this later on in the presentation. I'll bring up that concept of feedback and debriefing with volunteers and how important that is. And I think it's important for the sake of doing it and showing you care. But of course, it's also important to actually incorporate that feedback in times where you can. So I think it's both symbolically important and it means a lot to people to be asked. And also you get good input, obviously. So it kind of works both ways. Okay. Here's me. If you want to take a screenshot and grab my email address, if you have any questions and want to follow up. I don't think I mentioned at the beginning, I'm the community organizer and electoral organizer for LA Forward. So I do a bunch of different things. I do trainings just like this. I'm currently working on organizing lots of different progressives all over LA to run for neighborhood councils. So from LA Forward and also from different organizations like DSA, like Streets for All. There's many others. And basically, you know, I do all that. I also worked on some ballot initiatives and statewide propositions during during the fall election season. So we do lots of different things at LA Forward, but I just wanted to share my email in case you want to follow up with any questions. I'm happy to chat with you. And that's my dog, of course, featuring prominently in all of my author photos, if you will. Okay, so I'll skip this because we kind of went over those key concepts. So the first thing I want to talk about is comfort. So I think a lot of this feels really intuitive, right? Of course, we want volunteers to feel comfortable, but I think sometimes when we get really used to being in a space like our workplace, or a place where we volunteered for years, let's say, or in my case, it would be like, I'm really comfortable in the arena of a political campaign, for instance. I think sometimes we forget the things that we can do to help others feel comfortable in that space. So the first thing that I would say to that end is clear instructions. Clear instructions, expectations really help people feel comfortable. So that way they're understanding what their role is, for instance. In the case of something where you'd be expecting people to work alone, allowing them to pair up, allowing them to form groups. In the case of knocking on doors for a political candidate, right? I don't know, have either of you knocked on doors before? No? Jane's like, I'm not so sure. Have you done it, Lily?
Yeah, in high school.
In high school? Oh, wow. Did you go by yourself or did you go with a friend?
Yeah, it was like a group of us. It was for a class, so.
Oh, for a class. That's really cool. That's a neat class, man. I'd like to go back to school and do that. The reason I ask is because, Jane, does it freak you out a little bit going door to door? You made a face. That's the only reason I said that.
I've worked with the public enough that I don't know that I want to do that.
I get it. That's totally reasonable. It can be scary. So, this goes to comfort, right? For other people, maybe a volunteer role where they're standing for a long period of time is not the best, right? Maybe they're not comfortable shaking people's hands, so they shouldn't be a greeter at an event, just made up examples, but I think sometimes we assume that others are comfortable with what we're comfortable with, which is of course not the case, right? We want to be aware of individual differences and all that. I think also just making yourself available when people have questions, even when you think like, oh, the task they're doing is really simple, what questions could they possibly have? Just reminding yourself not to assume anything and remember that you never know, right? Just because you've done something 100 times doesn't mean that they're not going to have questions. And then the other thing would be to consider things like skill level and comfort level when you're assigning tasks. So again, it's intuitive, right? But what would be, for instance, Jane, what would be a task that would be like, what would a first-time volunteer at Bike Wave do?
So this is something that I always think is a little bit messed up and probably exacerbates the issue of volunteer retention when they don't really have like mechanical skills. Is we'll have them do a lot of the cleaning tasks, and it's a dirty, greasy, disgusting bike shop. So like I could see that as being really off putting if it's like your first time in this. I mean, even me,
Sure.
a cyclist, the first time I came in, I was like, this place is gross. So yeah, but it's like we're kind of like we don't really know. We'll have people like kind of watch the mechanics and try to learn a little bit, but then it's like, all right, well, what else can you do when it gets busy and we don't really have time to be like supervising,
right? Okay.
Sort through this parts bin or whatever.
Yeah, and I guess it's not necessarily like maybe there are some skills where you could learn a bit by playing around with the materials yourself, but I have a feeling working on a bike is maybe not one of those skills, just judging by my own experience trying to do bike repairs. Is that accurate? Like maybe there are things that are easier to do on your own, but if you're brand new, there may not be a lot that you could do without that hands-on guidance.
For sure, and it depends on your willingness to like, tinker. Some people are very comfortable with, tools in their hands, but I didn't grow up using like screwdrivers and stuff that much. So
totally.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I guess that's something to think about for Microwave is what are some tasks or what are some ways that volunteers can feel really welcomed and comfortable. And maybe cleaning for some volunteers, they're like, yeah, I'm happy to dive in and do that. But maybe for others, as you said, it could be a bit of a turnoff, it's hard to say. I mean, yeah, I definitely know what you mean. It could be like a greasy bike zone. I'm thinking of my dad's garage.
Yeah, some people are like, sure, let's clean, and this is another huge issue at the shop. And sorry, Lily, if I'm like making this too specific to microwave, but we have a huge gender imbalance. And that's actually true across sort of the bicycle space. And definitely in the microwave, when I came on, there was one other female volunteer, and I kind of made it like my personal mission to recruit more female volunteers, and I've had some success. We have now like 5 regular female volunteers, but there's like still like 20 regular male volunteers. So I did also notice that unfortunately, when it's like time to clean, a lot of the times it's like the women end up doing that, and that like just makes me really mad, I'm
Yeah.
like, what the heck? Like, this is messed up. So
yeah. Oh man, that's really tricky. Gosh, I was noticing that in meetings lately when sometimes, I'll be in meetings and it's like, oh, can we get a volunteer to take notes? And I've noticed very rarely will a man volunteer to take notes, at least in the meetings I'm in. I don't know if you all have noticed that. Yeah, sometimes, but I feel like it's more rare. Yeah, that's definitely something that can affect the dynamic. Certainly something like a gender imbalance for sure. Yeah, I unfortunately can't solve that, but maybe we can. I mean, I'm interested
I'll just throw it out there.
No, it's really interesting. I appreciate you sharing that. Yeah, I mean, on this slide, I shared a couple examples of, in the types of organizing work that I do. So like political campaigns, just having this schedule that's like, okay, bit by bit, minute by minute, these roles that are in red, green, blue, and orange, those are different volunteers, right? So chat is just someone who is simply copying and pasting links to put them in the chat, like the phone banking script, the link to the dialer to make calls, right? So that sounds like a really easy role, but it's actually important because it's a way to bring in a volunteer to be a lead on a phone bank, right? Which is no small thing, right? Maybe they've never run a phone bank before, so it's a way of leveling them up. And in my role as someone who's run hundreds of phone banks, I want them to feel comfortable. And so I've learned, because I've messed up, there have been times where I asked people to do different organizing tasks, like, hey, can you help run this phone bank? And maybe I took a little break. I left the house, I did an errand, and then I got a call and they were like, hey, where's the script, right? I didn't prepare them with everything they needed, and that was on me. So I've learned, creating this schedule of, okay, here's all the people who come into the Zoom 15 minutes early. If we're gonna have a speaker at the virtual event, they need to check their audio. Maybe they're in their car. We want to make sure we can see them and hear them. So anyways, that's very specific to, the type of organizing I do. But even telling people, who are we calling tonight? What types of voters? Why are they the targets for this phone bank? Or, who are the specific people whose doors we're knocking on, for instance? I shared this example. I worked for the Bernie Sanders campaign in Los Angeles. I was a field organizer, and it really feels like over a year ago. It's just been such a long, insane year. But I shared this graphic. We asked people to knock on 100 doors, and we said, okay, if you're if you're knocking on 100 doors in a weekend, we're going to celebrate you and put you on this social media graphic. And it was really fun because people wanted to be recognized. And so I have a bunch of these on Facebook because we would post them every weekend, right? So I share this because I think, number one, it's important for volunteers to, be successful and actually be effective and meet goals, but it's also important for them to feel that success and to feel that they're being effective, right? And to have kind of realistic expectations for what they're doing. So I think that's really key. You know, it depends on what you're doing, right? But for, you know, if they're knocking on doors for a campaign, or if they are, you know, signing people up in the community to do a certain, you know, program with the food bank, or signing kids up to take an art class. I don't know, just making this up. But like maybe they can sign up 10 families in a month and help those families get services, right? It doesn't mean that if they don't meet that numerical goal, they're a failure. It's just something to aim for. And I think it helps motivate people. I think the other thing I'll add is, you know, being clear about what is and isn't useful or effective. Just being honest with people, like, oh yeah, we do need people to do this, but doing this is not so, you know, we need people to do X, but doing Y and Z is maybe not so useful. I'm curious if either of you have ever had scenarios where you've had to kind of redirect volunteers in your work.
Not as much, again, just because it's like, I mean, pre-COVID, anybody could come into the bike wave and use the space, really. Like, we weren't, there's that culture of like, this is a community space, so you're welcome if you're a member of the community, which is anybody, right, who's nearby. You can come in the space. So even if people who were volunteering were just hanging out, like, that was an accepted thing, I guess, which other volunteers would, you know, grumble about sometimes, because you know, they're kind of maybe using the space and the resources and not really giving back much. But again, I don't know, there's a kind of peculiar collectivey, co-op-y culture there, I guess, you know.
What about you, Lily? Is that something you've ever run into, like kind of had to steer volunteers? Or I'm curious, like, tell me more about what volunteers do in your work.
I guess, yeah, we do have to steer volunteers sometimes, but I think just in a way of like, when things don't go as planned, we kind of have to shift the way we do things sometimes.
Yeah.
I guess one example is like this last Friday, because our distribution is every Friday, it was raining. And so we had a line of folks waiting in the rain, and it was like very unexpected. And we had like older folks, and yeah, like we didn't want folks waiting that long in the rain. And so we just had to like redirect like some of our volunteers depending on what they were doing. Like we decided, rather than have them pick out their produce, we would bag it for them. To just make the process a little faster. So we just kind of had to redirect volunteers, like, you know what, we're not going to do this. Let's just all start bagging.
Yeah, totally. I think that's definitely an important skill, to be able to make those game time decisions. And yeah, and also like to model being calm about it, even when internally you're like, it's raining, what are we gonna do? is a real skill that yeah, I'm thinking about this time when I was working for the Bernie campaign, where we had one of our biggest events. There were maybe 300 people there. And there were like celebrities there, which had helped draw people. And our internet that we would use to, you know, get our turf lists, like the doors for us to knock on, the internet was down. And so my boss gave me his credit card, and he was like, go to Office Depot and buy all of the clipboards that they have. So I like filled my Prius with clipboards to the brim. I have a good picture of it. I bought like 200 clipboards or something. and paper. Like I bought a ton of paper because we had to print out the lists. And then I got back, I got there and I was like, okay, I spent like, hundreds of dollars on clipboards. And he's like, the internet's back up. So it was like, my blood pressure was very intense. But I could tell that he was calm because he had dealt with scenarios like that before of having to make those quick changes. I think the other thing I would say is, as much as possible, like to share different examples or different possibilities for what success or what like being a good volunteer can look like. So for instance, in campaigns that I've worked on, maybe there are people who are really good on the phone or really good at the doors. They're really good at having those conversations with voters. And then there are people who are great volunteers, but they're really shy, they're introverted. Maybe they're better at data entry, which is extremely important for a campaign or really any organization or, even a business. Maybe they're really good at keeping the space organized. I think, as we all know, those skills are equal. I think they're all important. Keeping the bike repair area clean. It's like, well, that's a skill. And it, so I think helping people feel that all those things are valuable is a really key part of like managing and retaining volunteers as well. Any questions or thoughts before we move on?
I mean, I guess this is maybe related. What about when volunteers are kind of, for lack of a better word, behaving badly, just, doing, I mean, there are issues sometimes when a more experienced mechanic will tell a newer volunteer to, use a certain part to repair a bike or not use a certain part, and then they are just, for whatever reason, not listening to that, or, building the bike, with parts that for reasons, we don't want them to use or whatever.
Yeah, I'm curious how people currently deal with that. Is there like for instance, the people who are mentoring or guiding the new volunteers, is there training for them, or like what are the expectations, or it's more informal, more casual?
It's totally informal, and I feel like it's bitten us many times, and we end up kind of like, basically our conflict resolution strategy at the moment is the new volunteer will continue this behavior, and every more experienced volunteer who works with them gets more and more disgruntled, eventually sometimes causing the more experienced volunteers to actually step away from the organization.
Oh, wow.
And that's a kind of like toxicity that we obviously isn't good for the organization.
Yeah, of course.
But yeah, that has been a huge issue with the way that we govern and operate, I guess.
Yeah, that's really tricky, because I definitely see, obviously there's a lot of advantages to it being an informal, friendly community atmosphere. It sounds lovely, but yeah, of course, it's really tricky when conflicts come up. Yeah, I think there's a lot of parallels to the atmosphere of a political campaign, right? There are people who have really strong personalities who are fans of who are fans of Bernie Sanders or fans of any candidate that you're working for or cause you're working for. And so it's about kind of moving people towards, their individual needs and personality is important, but we're working, for a collective project, and anyways, it's tricky. I definitely sympathize for sure. The last, or the third kind of category is appreciation. So I think this is one that comes naturally to a lot of us who work in these fields. I think having a sense of gratitude for the people that you work with, helps us kind of come naturally. But I think a lot of this is just, having materials ready, really valuing people's time, and offering clear instructions on where to meet, what to bring. Will they need comfortable shoes? Will they need water and a snack? Will they need sunscreen? Is it a kid-friendly event? Is it pet-friendly? Is there parking available close to public transport? Any of those things that may or may not be relevant. I put a couple examples here of ways that I have done this. So on the right, this is like a little exercise that I did at a debrief after a campaign. So I asked people, what was your favorite part of the campaign? And it was cute to see, people's ideas. People liked meeting new organizers, meeting people throughout California. But I also liked how people would mention specific other people to kind of show gratitude for them. Like you see where it says piano interludes. We had this guy, John, in Santa Barbara who, if it were in-person phone banks, we never would have met this guy, right? Because he'd be at a separate phone bank. But because they were virtual on Zoom, he had his piano, and at the first phone banking event he was at, he was like, can I play a song, during the break? So he kind of serenaded everyone with a piano interlude. It was really cute. And it became like an expectation, people were like, when is John gonna play? It was really sweet. So anyways, there's lots of different ways you can incorporate this, on Slack. I don't know if either of you use Slack or, obviously you can do this on social media. I put an example here in a campaign I'm working on currently, a healthcare campaign. There were a group of people who were meeting with an elected official. So I knew they were kind of nervous. So I posted in Slack, like, big day for Shane, Jasmine, and other people who are having this meeting with the representative, hit this post with some good luck emojis, right? It takes 2 seconds. But I think it does make an impact, right? We all want to feel noticed, and we want to feel, valuable, and even in those really small ways, right? It's just like getting a text from a friend or letting a volunteer know that, that you appreciate their work. And then, this point about asking for feedback and incorporating it when you can. I'm curious, do either of you at your organizations, is this something that you do? Lily, is that something you do at LA Moss?
Yeah, especially at the beginning, because our produce distribution only started in September. And so we have this saying at LA Moss that we're building the plane as we're flying it. And so that's kind of what we were doing with this distribution. And so, yeah, we got a lot of feedback at the beginning, especially during COVID times and with social distancing and yeah, just all these things going on. And we also have tried to have as much as we can, like volunteer meetings on Zoom, and then kind of get feedback there and then incorporate it as much as we can.
Yeah, for sure. Hi, Jesus. I think he's connecting to audio. Jesus, we'll let your audio connect, but you can introduce yourself in a minute if you want. And we also have been recording today's training, so you can catch it from the beginning as well. But it's great to have you. I recognize you from phone banks. But yeah, Lily, thanks for sharing that. I think that saying resonates with me a lot, building the plane as you're flying it. It is, I think a lot of us in this kind of work understand that, and definitely in my work on campaigns, that is the feeling a lot of the time. That was the feeling when, when I ran out and bought 200 clipboards and so on. Hi, Jesus. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, how are you doing today?
Doing good. How are you? Do you want to briefly introduce yourself since we have a small group? Do you want to share what brought you here today and your neighborhood?
Well, I'm Jesus Rosas or Jesse Rosas, and here on Highland Park, I've been for many 32 years, I believe. I've been involved in different things, and I want to learn exactly how you guys doing. And I'm interested to participate, and probably very soon I will ask you to participate more. I want to thank you for today.
Of course. Yeah. So we're partway through, like I was saying, with the presentation. But we did record it. So we're going to post the recording on the website so I can send it out to all of you so that you can catch it from the beginning if you want, Jesse.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. See, where was I? Oh, feedback. So, you know, I think sometimes asking for feedback, I'll speak for myself. I think sometimes I struggle with it because sometimes I feel like, okay, what if I get all these ideas, but I know that I can't implement them, right? Or what if I get feedback and I'm like, I totally, you know, and a volunteer will say something and I'm like, you know what, I agree, but we can't change that. We're stuck with it the way it is. So I think that's a real skill as a leader or as someone who is a staff member working with volunteers, or even a volunteer working with other, you know, peers. It's the skill of being able to say, you know, I hear you, but unfortunately we can't change that, but here are the things that we can accommodate, you know? So for instance, maybe they're asking for a certain shift time, or, you know, a different location, and you're like, well, you know, those are the things we can't be flexible on, but here are the things we can. And, you know, I understand parking's difficult around here, you know, having to come early for parking or whatever it is that they are, that they have feedback or, you know, or complaint about. And I think it's really tricky because I think a lot of us are people pleasers. And I don't say that in a negative way. I don't mean that in a negative way. I think in a lot of respects, it's a good thing, right? We want people to be pleased. We want people to be happy and we're kind. But I think sometimes being able to just be clear about what accommodations you can make and what you can't, people really respect that in my experience, because you're just being honest and direct. And I think the other thing too that I'll say in terms of volunteer retention and feedback is that I think debriefing with people about how an event went or how their shift went, you know, particularly if they're a first-time volunteer, can actually be a really effective tool for getting them to come back. So for instance, you know, in my case with, you know, political organizing, if someone is a first timer at a phone bank, I might call them up afterwards and say, how was it? Tell me about your experience. And I'm doing so mostly without an agenda. Mostly I just want to hear how it went. Maybe they have some good feedback for next time, or maybe they're letting me know they're really shy and they were kind of nervous. But I also do have a little agenda, and that agenda is, in my experience as an organizer, I know that when people feel heard and when they feel that their input is being well received, they're more likely to come back for a second event, especially if they had a positive experience. But even if they had a negative experience, just the fact that I called them up or texted them and said, hey, you know, do you have 30 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever it is, to debrief with me about your shift. I think people really appreciate both the gesture and the actual ability to provide that feedback. I'm curious if anyone has any questions or you know, thoughts on, like, do you feel like the volunteers at your organization feel appreciated? Not so much. Depends on the day.
I have a question about the follow-up. Do you find like a phone call chat to be the most effective, more than, like, say, having them fill out like a survey on paper or online or something, because it has that like one-to-one personal connection? Or
That's a good question. I mean, I think it just depends on what your capacity is, how many people you're able to recruit to do the calls. I think one thing with a survey, I would say, is I think a survey is great if you can find a way of showing people that you're hearing and or incorporate, or one, hearing, but maybe also two, incorporating what they said. So for instance, like if you sent, maybe you could send out an email like summarizing some of the key points and like what you're doing to address them, or even inviting volunteers to help address those things. Something like that to kind of show that you're synthesizing what you learned. I think phone calls are good because you get a sense of people's personality. Like for instance, I'm trying to think of a good example. I just think you can learn a lot. You know, some people have a lot to say in those debriefs, other people don't, right? It's like some volunteers kind of just want to be told what to do, and others don't. Others want to push back, and I think that's a good thing. It's a positive. Others want, you know, more direction. I think you can learn a lot about that in a phone conversation. But like I said, it just depends on capacity and how many people you have. I think a survey could be good. Are you currently doing something like that?
No, we really don't.
That's okay. You're not in trouble.
Well, I'm thinking it's a good idea, especially for people who seem a little bit, you know, out of their comfort zone or whatever when they first come in. But I mean, the classic microwave mantra almost is when somebody so we have, our structure is that we have a member meeting each month. So anybody who's volunteered a certain number of hours can attend the member meeting and, you know, bring up any ideas they want to talk about, anything, and everybody gets a equal vote in the decision making. But the classic thing when especially a new volunteer makes a suggestion is, great suggestion, you know, do you want to implement it?
Yeah, totally.
You know, it's a lot easier to come up with ideas than it is to actually
yes,
implement them. So
yeah, totally. What about you, Jesse or Lily?
But I'd like to know what your thoughts, and now with this pandemic, you think there's going to be more difficult to contact people, to do phone banking and door knocking? You think there will be more hard this time, even though there's pandemic by that time? If we do anything during this year, by that time probably the pandemic is going to be out of the mind of the people. But still, what is your thoughts on this?
Yeah, that's a good question. Are you talking about in terms of recruiting volunteers to do the phone banking or the canvassing? Or are you talking about how people view the actual?
But both, you know,
both.
to get volunteers can do over the phone, door
Yeah.
knocking, and, you know, what do you think people being reacted? And
Yeah.
when you volunteer comes in front of the door and knocking and asking questions, or asking to vote for someone or for any propositions that may have, what do you think?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think there's different considerations. I mean, the first one, of course, is safety and making sure that you have safety precautions in place. And I think we have seen that people have been able to do safe door knocking. You know, an example would be like in swing states before the election, like, you know, Arizona, for instance, or during the Georgia runoff election. But I guess what I would say is like maybe just using something like canvassing strategically. So maybe, you know, you're not knocking on every door in the district, but you are calling as many people as possible. And then you're specifically knocking on doors of people who are undecided, right? Because you want to use that face-to-face in-person conversation in a way that's going to be as effective as possible, and also in a way that's going to be as engaging and interesting as possible for the volunteers. And typically that most interesting type of conversation is one where you're talking with a voter who's undecided. But it's hard to say. I think not, you know, we don't always know, just like you're saying, Jesse, like we don't always know how the pandemic will affect
Right. Yeah.
the elections. And
Yeah.
that's hard to say.
No, thank you.
Yeah, for sure. It's good to have you.
So,
The other thing
Yeah.
I would just muting him real quick. The other thing I would say that I think is really important too is making sure that volunteers understand their role in the larger project. So if it's a campaign, right, if they're doing data entry, how can you show them, you know, you're not just doing data entry, you're actually making it possible for us to track all of the conversations that we have with thousands of voters every day, right? And that's important because conversations translate to votes. And we need thousands upon thousands, millions of votes to win, right? You know, can you show them that, you know, guiding new volunteers to knock on doors and have effective conversations, that helps them multiply their impact, right? Which helps then energize new volunteers, and the people they train could then train new people, right? And it's this domino effect. I think it's really important. We all want to feel that we're part of a larger purpose, that our, you know, the tasks at hand and the volunteer roles that we're doing are part of something larger than ourselves. I think the other thing too, and you know, this is more relevant to political work, is just being realistic about what it takes to win, right? So if we're working on a ballot measure, you know, just being honest about the number of votes that's required, or you know, if we were working on a housing project with, you know, unhoused people in LA, right? Being honest about what is actually required to get someone housing, you know, for instance. I'm curious, since we all have these kind of different examples we're working with, different scenarios, how do you feel like this fits in this concept of like people understanding their role in the larger work?
Not sure I have a clear answer to that, but
Totally
I
fine.
do have a question on how you zoom out to help volunteers understand that relationship. Is it through, like, I'm imagining like a sitcom chat or something?
Yeah, I love that, a sitcom chat. Yeah, I think, I mean, those examples I gave about different tasks people could be doing and then their relationship to the larger organizing work, that is how I would do it. So for instance, if someone is, I'm trying to think, what's an example? Okay, here's an example. So in campaigns, we have to cut turf, and basically turf cutting means, and maybe some of you have done this, turf cutting is, we don't knock on every door, right? Because number one, not everyone's registered to vote. And unless we're doing a voter registration drive, we're probably going to focus on registered voters. And number two, probably there are going to be people that are going to be a lot harder to convince than others. And that doesn't mean it's not worth it to talk to them. Everybody is valuable as a voter, but we can't talk to everybody, right? Unless we have, you know, millions upon millions of volunteers, which most campaigns don't. So when people are cutting turf, what they're actually physically doing is they're on a website, they're on their computer, and they're using their mouse to basically draw around houses to cut a shape of a map that has, you know, 40 or 50 houses in a turf. So then the computer spits out a list of houses for Lily or Jesse or Jane to knock on, right? Doors to knock on. So when they're actually doing that task, it's pretty frustrating, I'll be honest, right? Because they're like drawing around the little houses, and sometimes it makes a weird shape and they have to start over because they've seen that it actually requires driving a long distance as opposed to just walking from house to house. And so in my experience of being a staff person for a campaign, it can be a frustrating task. It requires some like even dexterity, almost like if you're drawing, because you're using a mouse. So if I was talking to a volunteer and like zooming out to help them understand why that kind of annoying, like fine motor skill work is important, I would say what I just said to you all, which is we can't knock on every door. So we have to take our capacity and our energy and put it towards the people that we can most effectively persuade, or the people that are already with us who we don't need to persuade, who will be turning out to vote. So what you're doing when you're cutting turf is you're making it possible for volunteers to have as many possible good conversations with voters who are either already on our side or possible to move. And without you cutting that turf, we would have to knock on every door, which we don't have time for. It's not effective. It's not efficient. And volunteers would have a crappy experience and they wouldn't come back. Does that make sense? That's, you know, that's if I were sitting down with someone and they were frustrated with cutting turf, right? I might go into that little spiel.
So is this like something that more comes up at the point when you perceive somebody's starting to become frustrated or view their task as menial or whatever, or does this happen preemptively?
That's a good question. I think it could happen preemptively. I think either way. I mean, I think obviously if someone's a volunteer and they're frustrated with the task to the point of not wanting to do it, no one's requiring them to do it. But I also think that in organizing for a political cause, there is a sense of obligation that kind of like underscores a lot of people's involvement, right? It's like it's an ethical obligation that one feels to organize. So I think a lot of times you're playing to that, right? Not in a manipulative way, but just in a way of, you know, someone has to do this work. And this is another piece of it too, that might be relevant to your work as well, is like, or any of our work, someone has to do this work. And the reason why you, Jane, or whoever are a good person to do this work are, you know, you're good with technology or you're good with repair or whatever. Does that make sense? Like you're organizing them into it.
Yeah.
But I think preempting it is key as well, right? Like if I'm asking someone to organize maps for people to go canvassing, I might be like, it seems silly, but if these are disorganized, volunteers are going to have a bad experience and we won't knock on enough doors or whatever. Just kind of zooming out for them. That's about it in terms of slides. Those are sort of the main 4 key elements, right? Feeling appreciated, comfortable, successful, and then understanding how their role is situated in the larger project. But I'm happy to take any questions or like scenarios that any of you are dealing with in your work.
I guess one of the questions I have is, and I feel like this could maybe be, you know, pretty general. So obviously during the pandemic, it's much easier to access people online virtually. So that has definitely shaped the profile of people who are volunteering for us now. It's, you know, much more likely that they're going to be like, you know, young white males, really, who have access to the internet and the social media sites and, you know, that kind of thing. Whereas before it was like we had a sign, physical sign in the window, volunteers needed. So people would, you know, walk in and be like, hey, I'm interested in volunteering.
Got it.
Is that anything that you have thoughts on dealing with?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So are you referring to like in terms of recruiting new volunteers, maybe how to, that's a good question. Yeah, gosh, I'm not sure. I would have to think about that. But that's really interesting that you're experiencing that. I think this isn't exactly what you're saying, but something that I've dealt with is in creating like virtual ways for people to volunteer. sometimes it's difficult for parents to find time. And, you know, sometimes there's this tension might be a strong word, but well, tension between the needs of different people, right? So parents might need an event to start at 8:30 after the kids have gone to bed. But for people without kids, starting an event at 8:30 might be really late, right? So it's just this difficult, you know, always trying to manage that and help people be understanding of one another. But yeah, in terms of like internet access and social media and stuff, I mean, I definitely know everybody's on social media. I think one thing I'll say is like, you know, if you're trying to involve people of different ages, for instance, you know, people of different ages using different types of social media is definitely a phenomenon we're all familiar with, right? As I learned from when I used to be a ninth grade teacher and they were like, we don't use Facebook, Miss Kessel. They only use Facebook for parties, which was a concept I was unfamiliar with. But I think that is something to look into because I think, you know, almost everybody's on social media and maybe there's a creative way to, I don't know, use YouTube to show what Bikerwave does or something like that. David actually from LA Forward was talking about doing like political TikToks, which I'm not cool enough for. I would need help on that. But yeah, just a thought. Yeah, that's really interesting though. Any other questions or scenarios? What about you, Lily? Are there ways that did you start your job during the pandemic? You did. Wow.
Yeah. So I actually started as a volunteer. So LA Moss was delivering produce bi-weekly to residents, and they're focusing on residents in Elysian Valley. And so because I live in Elysian Valley, I got a phone call like asking if we needed like produce, and I actually I grew up here, so I've worked at the local park. I used to work at the elementary school, so I knew a lot of people, and one of the volunteers I actually knew. And so, yeah, I was just kind of like, actually, I want to volunteer. And then I started, working. And I think that's just one way we've gotten a lot of volunteers. Like, that's how I got on board. And I've gotten a few people on board just the same way, like, hey, you know, we need help. Like, can you come volunteer? But I think, like Jane said, because of the pandemic, I think our volunteers are a very specific group. We also have a lot of young people, people who are more tech savvy, folks who are working from home and probably have a more flexible schedule now.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we had the same thing going on. And then so what we did do recently is we just started printing out, you know, old-fashioned flyering.
Yeah.
We just printed out a bunch of flyers and we were distributing them on site. And one of the things is that people who pick up produce are mostly Spanish speakers, or and then like our volunteers are mostly English speakers. And so again, just because like of the technology and us not being able to access like other folks, flyering was what helped us. So once we were flyering, like the next week we just had like 3 people show up like, hey, I came to volunteer.
That's great.
Yeah,
I love that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess it's a way to find people, in a particular neighborhood, put flyers in that neighborhood. Yeah.
So was it a purely like volunteer recruitment flyer? Like,
like we just,
volunteers.
Like we just put, we need volunteers, like please come. I mean, and it worked. And I think it's also just because like, I think it was like the language barrier, just like the communication barriers that we had, that people thought
Yeah.
everyone who was at the produce distribution were employees of LA Moss, or because we're
Mm,
also working with like LA Compost and Food Forward. And so I think it was just a disconnect that people didn't realize, like, no, everyone here is a volunteer. And so once they realized that, they're like, oh, I can come help, or I can send my daughter over. So yeah.
yeah, that makes sense. Like having that clear, giving people a clear idea of who's volunteer and who's staff. Yeah, totally. Well, that's all I have for you. I'm happy to stick around. Jesse, do you have other questions for me? I know you missed the beginning, so you can catch the recording.
Yeah. I just want to hear your thoughts on the sharing that you have. You know, the social media is worksheet for candidates. You want to do outreach to voting for a preposition or a candidate. The social media works better than door knocking, direct contact, on your experience.
You mean in getting people's votes, or
Yes.
just educating people about the candidate?
Well, just getting people votes.
I think it's good to have a combination of tactics always. I think if you're trying to persuade someone, the best, most effective technique is multiple touches, which basically means they're not just hearing about the candidate one time and having one conversation, they're having multiple conversations with trained volunteers. So that might be a phone call and then someone at their door, listening to them, not debating or arguing, being really kind and validating, and then making a direct ask for them to support that candidate. That would be the most effective way to persuade them. But if they're already a supporter, yeah, I think social media is a really powerful way to, do simple things like reminding them to vote, or maybe, when I worked for the Bernie campaign, people had to request a Democratic ballot if they were registered as no party preference, right? So social media can be a good way to educate people about things like that. Or, right now, LA Forward is working on neighborhood council organizing. So making sure people request a ballot in time. Yeah, I think social media is great. It's a great tactic, especially now, especially during the pandemic.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I'll stop sharing my screen. I'll pause the recording. Let's see.